Welcome to a splits practice. We'll start off with a few stretches to warm us up before we go all the way into the front splits. Some things to keep in mind as we stretch. Easing in and out of the stretch at first is a nice way to gently and effectively warm up the muscles and stretch effectively. And then P&F stretching is when you gently contract the muscles that are being stretched. So from our standing forward fold, we can increase the stretch with standing splits. You can walk your hands further back to increase the stretch. And we're working our way towards a straight knee, but we don't need to lock out the knee of the leg that we're standing on. So again, it's okay to ease off the stretch, gently bending the knee, and then working your way towards a straight knee. And we can start wiggling around that top leg too. You can see me moving in and out with my breath. To continue to breathe. You probably hear a lot, but that breath really, really helps with this all. When you're in your standing forward fold, pulling on your toes or the back of your legs gives you leverage to go into a deeper stretch. All right, so if we come into a low lunge, the Anjaneyasana, we can really get into the hips for a really deep hip flexion. So if you can get down to your elbows, that works really well. I like reaching that one arm forward. Some of those gentle wiggles and bounces can help loosen things up. And then actively press your feet into the floor for a little extra stretch, that P&F stretch. Release to the half splits, and this is kind of just a warm up before we get into the full splits. Again, you can work your way towards a straight leg, and pushing that foot into the floor gives you a little extra P&F stretch. When we switch and do the other side, and get a little release and counter stretch. All right, so you can have those back toes curled under, or you can press the top of your foot into the floor. Either or works. I often like pushing down on the top of the foot. And if you are hyper flexible in this area, stick a block underneath your foot, and that gives you a little more space to sink your hips and shoulders down a little bit deeper. And don't forget to breathe and actively root the feet into the floor. When you come into your half splits, root down that front heel and pull the hips back. I like working with the ankle. And then our next stretch, we're going to come up into a lunge against the wall to work on stretching the hip flexors. So you're going to want to probably use a blanket or double up your mat or something like that so that you have some cushioning underneath your knee. You can get your knee pretty close to the wall, or you can get it right up next to the wall, so long as it doesn't hurt. And you can explore sinking the hips forward and see how that feels on the hip flexors near the front of your pelvis. Or you can work on pushing your back against the wall, which to me feels better usually. Staying for around 45 seconds to 60 seconds or so. You can add a little bit of movement to feel some different fibers getting stretched. You bring that arm up and you're going to get a little more stretch, especially if you add a little bit of a side bend. If you add the P&F stretch, you're actively pressing that back foot into the wall. Just a little bit, doesn't take much. And then what's really helpful with this is the follow-up, standing splits against the wall. Now it's a closed chain stretch and you got a little more leverage to push in a little bit deeper. This is a really deep stretch for that front foot, that hamstring. And of course, you can work on your handstands. You can work on that active mobility by pressing off the floor. Okay. And if you do the standing splits, that's an easy way to drop in on the other side. It can be kind of awkward setting this one up, so that's a good way to come in. Remember that you can ease off the stretch and then come back into it. That's a nice way to gently and effectively increase your stretch, so you don't need to charge into it 100% right off the get-go. We can ease in and out. It's a nice, safe way to practice. And if you bring up that same side arm, that's going to tug on the psoas just a tiny bit more. And you can work to get your back against the wall. You can add a little bit of a side stretch to help get that hip flexor stretch. Take a couple more breaths. And this is really going to help flexibility of that back leg when you do the front splits. When you follow up with the standing splits against the wall, this is mainly to work on that front leg. Really nice way to get extra leveraged stretch on that front hamstring. Explore walking your hands closer and closer towards the wall, possibly lifting off the ground, especially if you have a handstand practice. Again, this active mobility is going to be really helpful in the long run. And do a little counter stretch there. And next, we're going to stretch the lateral side of our hip, getting some of those muscles that blend into the IT band. If you like pigeon, work on pigeon. Just don't hold it for way too long or push too hard. You could do it from a balancing position here, or you could do that figure 4 stretch lying on your back. You can brace your arms any way you like to that works effectively for you. And holding it for around 45 to 60 seconds at a time on either side, of course. So I'm going a little fast just to kind of get through the demo. I'm just kind of playing with some silly arm variations. You don't really need to do those for the sake of doing the splits. And we're not really stretching the IT band itself. That tissue doesn't really stretch that much. This is really to get the muscles that blend into the IT band, like tensor fascia lata and gluteus medius, which will help a little bit with our splits. Okay, next, we'll get into the inner thighs. This will help with middle splits. We're just kind of focusing mostly on front splits, but sometimes those adductor muscles are really tight, and that's going to affect the hamstrings as well. So even if you're only working on the front splits, this is probably going to help. So we're taking a horse stance. PNF stretching, by contracting those muscles that are being stretched, means your arms are pushing out against your legs to add some resistance, and your legs are moderately squeezing in against your arms. We'll hold it for about 45 seconds or so. You can also kind of wiggle around a little bit, do some gentle bounces, or come in and out of this to stretch in that manner. For that hip flexibility, you can try and sink your elbows down towards the floor. And just remember to breathe. Your follow-up stretch after that is straightening out the knees. They don't need to lock out, but they can get pretty gosh darn straight. And you can probably go a little bit wider than your horse stance. You don't have to rush it. You can just slowly walk out the feet a little bit wider and a little bit wider. And focus on dropping the chest and head down towards the floor as the toes point forward. From here, we can come into our Skandasana or side lunge. This will, again, kind of get the adductors and maybe a little bit of the hamstrings on that long extended leg. You can add the side bends. That's just kind of for funsies. This also helps with kind of active mobility, being able to squat down low on that bent knee. It takes a lot of hip flexibility and a bit of strength, so that certainly helps a bit with our front splits. For PNF stretching here, just actively root your feet down into the floor. All right, and then we're going to come back to that wide-legged forward fold, just to kind of center things out. Maybe you inch in a tiny bit deeper. We're never going to stretch so hard or so far that it hurts, though. There's no need to do that. You don't need to tear your body apart to get flexible. All right, from here, we're just about ready to go into our full splits. So maybe you shake out the legs a little bit. We're going to come back first into that low lunge Anjaneyasana pose first, and then we'll inch our way into the front splits. It might be helpful to have some blocks, especially if you're like me and your hips don't sink all the way down to the floor. Those blocks can be really helpful, as you'll see here in just a moment. So I'm just kind of taking a flow down to the floor. You can work on your standing split on your way back towards the low lunge. And this is to gently kind of warm up the hip, that front hip. I really enjoy reaching back and getting a final hip flexor stretch. This is mainly getting the quads, but there is one quad that is a hip flexor. So it still does help us a little bit, but the quadriceps, unless you have really tight quads, the quads usually aren't an issue too much for your splits. So we start in the half splits, and then we're just gonna slide that heel forward, and we're gonna let it take some time to get in there. So what I do is I have those blocks underneath my hands, so I'm not driving too much pressure into the back of my knee or hips. And if you bend that front knee a little bit, take some of the edge off, like so. Take a breath or two, and then you straighten that front leg back out again. You either inch in a little bit deeper, or you just go back to where you were. And that way you're not, again, tearing apart your hamstring. We want to feel it stretch, obviously, but not so strong that it hurts. If you're close enough to the floor, stick a block underneath your thigh and butt and lift those arms up. And practice adding a little bit of a side bend. So that's helping stretch my right psoas a little bit extra. And again, that back hip, that right hip, is usually more of a factor than the front one. At least it is for me. I have fairly flexible hamstrings. We can also work on the forward fold, which is working on that front hamstring. Basically just adding some movement in the upper body as we hold the splits here. And then one other thing you can try, it's not my favorite thing, but reaching for that back foot. Again, it's really targeting the quads, one of which attaches to your pelvis as a hip flexor. So that can be quite intense if you don't have a deep back bend like I do. And the other thing we do is take that block out and PNF stretch by rooting your feet down into the floor. And then we work on that active mobility. This is one of my favorite things to do. Lift up that front leg. You could do some pulses or just try and hold there. You can do this with your ankle dorsiflexed or plantar flexed. That's going to give you some more active range of mobility. And then when we release, sweep it back to a down dog, three-legged dog. I like doing this little flip dog counter stretch where you have your shin on the floor. Kind of counter stretch is all that hip flexion. And you can get a nice counter stretch here. If you know the name of this stretch, please let me know. I don't know what that one is. And then kind of like a half hero's pose, having that leg that was forward, my left leg was forward in the front splits. Now it's folded back as a counter stretch. I usually just hold this just for a few breaths. But here are some things you can do just to kind of work with that stretch. You can hug the leg in, or you could explore straightening out that right leg for a little extra hamstring stretch if you wanted. Like so. I find it a little bit easier to use the opposite side arm to hold that foot. You don't need to hold this for very long. This is just kind of a counter stretch. You can also do a little half lotus to kind of pin down the leg that's getting the thigh stretch. All right. And then coming back through your down dog, we'll explore just sweeping all the way through back into that front splits just for a little bit. I'm doing the PNF stretch by pushing down my feet. And then you can find your way to the other side any way you like to with those blocks. I'm going to a little straddle sit and extend the leg back. That's kind of a little extra credit there. Any way you want to, just find your way back to the lunge on the other side. Remember, we're easing into the front splits. So first working on that back leg, working on the hip flexor by grabbing the back foot. You could do this with either hand. I like using the opposite side hand, getting that twist. It's just a little bit of an easier grab and it feels gentler on my knee. PNF stretching by pushing that foot into the hand contracts the quads. Right, and again, we're just going through our half splits and easing in by sliding that heel forward. Blocks underneath the hands to help moderate the pressure and weight. Taking your time. It should take around 5 breaths or maybe a little bit longer to inch into your deepest front splits. No matter what, it's going to take you at least that much time to inch in as deep as you can. Remember, you can bend that front knee, ease off the tension, and then straighten it back out. And then once you feel like you want to move the upper body around, consider throwing a prop underneath your thigh and butt. That way, arms come up, Yogis call that Hanumanasana, the monkey god pose. And that side stretch is really going to help with that back hip, increasing that hip flexor mobility. Work on your forward fold. And if you are less flexible like I am, it's okay if the hips don't square off. So my hips aren't pointing directly at 12 o'clock. They're a little bit maybe closer to 11 o'clock. That's okay. If you're experiencing pain in your front splits, you probably shouldn't square off the hips. If you're more flexible and there's no pain, then you can square the hips to point directly ahead at 12 o'clock to increase the mobility. But the femur bone doesn't sit perfectly well usually in the hip socket when it's directly at 12 o'clock. Usually when it's winged out a little bit, it just fits in there real nicely, and you'll probably find that's a little less painful. So you don't need to square off your hips unless you're really into contortion, or if that's just how your body works. Again, we'll work on those lifts. If you can't seem to get that lift, scoot back a little bit like you're in the half splits, and it becomes a little bit easier to get that lift. It's not the most fun thing for most people, but it's going to help a lot, especially if you want to make this really applicable and being able to take long strides, big leaps, stuff like that. You shake it out in a down dog or three-legged dog, flip your dog over, get that thigh, quad, hip flexor stretch there, or in the half hero position. Scoop the hips up. Again, if you know the name of that pose right here, please leave it in the comments section because I want to know what you call it. All right. Again, you don't need to do this for too long. This is just a little counter stretch, a little relief. So maybe around 5 breaths, 7 breaths tops. You can lay on your back. You can prop yourself up. Reach the arm overhead for a little extra stretch. Now reaching for that opposite side leg and bringing it in increases the stretch. You can do it with a bent knee. That usually works pretty well. You could try with a straight leg. You can see how much that lifts my thigh and knee up. It really tugs on the hip flexor when you have the opposite leg going the opposite direction. So that's a way to really increase the stretch if you're not feeling much, or if you just really want a super deep stretch. All right, so we're gonna roll out of this, shake it out, and we'll go to that same side we were just working on in the splits one more time as a little follow-up. And then we're just gonna repeat everything else one more time with the splits to just really hit everything home and work on that stretch. So coming through with that right leg, I'm staying off the block so that I can actively root my legs down into the floor. And of course, just continue to breathe. We hear it a lot in yoga classes, but that really makes a big difference. Again, you don't have to do it this way, but maybe pass through a little straddle sit and come back over to that original side. Easing in, hinge that front knee a few times before you come in all the way. Again, think about it taking at least 5 breaths for you to inch in all the way. And I've got those back toes curled under to add some mobility, rocking forward and backward a few times. You can do it with your toes curled under, or you can have the top of your foot pressed down into the floor. Bringing the arms up works stretching that back hip, right? So if you feel like that back hip, your hip extension is your weakness, then work on having the prop underneath you and bringing those arms up, maybe reaching for that back foot. Some of you can reach your foot with your arms overhead like that. If your hamstrings are tight, work on that forward fold. And you can do that with plantar flexion, pointing your toes, or you can do a dorsiflexion. The dorsiflexion is going to give you a little more calf stretch, which in turn pulls on the hamstrings a little bit. But if you're a gymnast, you're probably going to end up pointing your toes. Stretches should be for about a minute. So if you're breathing slowly, that's maybe 7 breaths, maybe upwards of 10 breaths. That's one way to measure it. You probably don't need to hold a stretch much longer than about a minute. So you can give yourself a break. All right, active flexibility or arm balance, your way out of it. And we'll work on that final side. Starting in that lunge. Inch in nice and slow. Passing through your half splits. When you come to your edge, consider hinging your knee and then sliding in a little bit deeper. Totally fine to have the block stay underneath the hands if that works well for you. If you are hyper flexible and you have no problem coming into the splits and you need to go further, you can work on your over splits by having a block or some other prop underneath your front leg so that it's beyond 180 degrees to work on your over splits. Obviously be careful with this. Some of you are naturally a little more flexible than the rest of us or have been working on it for a long time, so you can work on your over splits, but I wouldn't recommend it unless there's no pain. And don't forget to breathe the whole time. And then, even though, again, it's not that much fun, see if you can really lift that front leg off the floor. And if you can't really do it, scoot back more towards the half splits. If you've got an arm balance practice, lift up both legs. And that wraps up our splits practice. Repeat any of those stretches a couple times if you want to go hard. And let me know if you have any feedback or questions. Thanks.